Welcome to the session on leveraging regional integration to preserve Africa's wealth. With me, Franklin Obiodum, Professor of Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki as the chair. Andrew Fisher of the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, part of Erasmus University Rotterdam, will give the first and only paper. For some 3 decades now, Dr. Fisher has been pursuing an agenda of inclusion in international development processes and outcomes, both in practice and academia. As a writer himself and as editor for many outlets, including Development and Change. This body of work has been widely recognized. His book, Poverty as Ideology, was awarded the International Studies in Poverty Prize. Dr. Fisher seeks to redress, but he also frequently embodies contradictions. Indeed, although he champions equality, he is professor of inequality, much like professors of peace whose research is on war. It is surely unfair to liken Professor Fisher's unusual approach to those approaches in George Orwell's 1984, in which the Ministry of Truth is concerned with news produced to make people think the opposite of what is true. But one look at the title of Professor Fisher's paper today will give you a flavor of what lies ahead. If unequal exchange is essentially about so-called legitimate trade and says little or nothing about the illegitimate trade in slaves, why don't we reject the unequal exchange by parity of reasoning? Judge Yusuf, the great Somali jurist, recently captured such tensions when he referenced Anatole France's observation that, quote, "The law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread," unquote. An argument built on fallacious methodology is fundamentally flawed. So why rescue, not reject it? Can regional integration under these contradictions be leveraged to preserve Africa's wealth? Please join me in welcoming Professor Martin Fisher to present his case.
I'll actually time myself, so thank you, so much for that introduction. It was, and it's a real honor to be here as well. Oh, okay, great. Here, I'll just put a timer on so I keep track of myself. It's a real honor to be here in this gathering, and thanks so much to Ndongo in particular, and Charles and others, everyone who was involved for bringing this together. And I can just actually start with a bit of promotion. I mean, if we've been talking about reparations so far, but last year we produced what we call a forum issue of Development and Change on the issue of the political economy of reparations. It was very much the brainchild of Ndongo, who led the process, was the intellectual leader, and also produced, I would say, a huge part of this introductory article, which in itself is, I think, a huge contribution to the scholarship. I wouldn't like to say there was unequal exchange in the process of work there, but he was definitely the leader. So I would encourage you, all of you, to look at this. And also, the articles included some really interesting pieces. Including by Kahinda Andrews and Dandini Sundar and others. So it's a great piece if you haven't noticed it already. But my issue today, obviously, is the opposite of reparations, because the concern of reparations is how to move the flows of wealth from the rich to the poor countries, in particular to Africa. Whereas following on from Jayati's point, I think this follows very well, because what she was talking about was this dominant trend of wealth flows from south to north, which is what I'll be talking about. And the framing, obviously, I think the way we've come to frame these wealth flows is in the terminology of illicit financial flows. And also more recently, there's this been blossoming literature on what's called unequal exchange, or a version of unequal exchange, claims to have measured it. And I think the main point I would make in this lecture is not to belittle the importance of illicit financial flows and so on, but that the problems are more fundamental, because the wealth flows don't necessarily depend on illicitness. They're actually quite licit in a sense. And even if you address illicitness, you will still have these huge flows of wealth, and I think my criticism as well of the unequal exchange literature in essence is that it puts the focus on trade data, which I think is hugely problematic, and we need to shift the focus back into the space of production and the control of production and the distribution of production, rather than on the trade statistics. And so in that sense, I think that literature has done a bit of a disservice in distracting our attention away from that, which hopefully I'll make clear in this presentation, in particular through some of my empirical work on Zambia, which I've been wanting to expand into a continental project, but I would probably need the help of a lot of people to do that, so maybe that's something we can talk about. With no further ado, also just a bit of background. My work on Zambia was actually profiled in a lead editorial in The Guardian in June, which was a very interesting experience, because it then gave a lot of attention, a lot of people writing me. You could see how framing the issues in this way hit a real sensitive point for a lot of people. First Quantum Minerals was writing me because they wanted to know, they wanted to have a copy of my report in which they thought they were named. And so it raises the issue that actually framing the issues this way might actually give a bit more traction in terms of sort of what the legal scholars would call justiciability, in terms of identifying the nature of flows and so on. But that being said, I actually had false advertisement. I made a mistake, and I wasn't actually presenting this paper in this conference, and so I didn't actually have the paper ready. So this person from Quantum First Minerals just keeps writing me every month for the paper. I still have to send it to him, but I promised it to Ndongo, so I should have it soon. But as I was saying, the illicit finance and capital flows and misinvoicing and so on, which focuses on misinvoicing, transfer pricing, a whole bunch of different mechanisms by which international companies, multinational companies will try to evade reporting their proceeds, revenues and so on, and thereby evade taxation or mining royalties and other forms of tax and non-tax revenue collection from governments, right? So that's the main argument. And you've had a variety, most of these methods of trying to measure this are based on what we call residual methods. So this is basically what, say, the Global Financial Integrity Group has done, the AU with UNECA, and UNCTAD, Nikumana and Boyce and others basically use this residual method, which is the most common one is what's called the mirror trade analysis, the mirror analysis of trade data, or what's also called the partner country method, which is basically you look at two countries, one country exports to the other country imports to the other country. If you see a discrepancy between those two, you identify that as a possible case of illicit financial sources, because what's happening is the exporter is underreporting their exports to the country that's importing them. Now, the problem with this is, and there's a bunch of other methods as well, and actually I would encourage you to look at, I'll show you the report later. There's African Union came out with their latest report in August, which I think is a very good discussion. The appendix in particular has a really good discussion of all of the various methods of trying to measure these things. But the issues is that like a lot of these different methods, the effort is often to put a number to the amount of illicit trade, which often leads to sort of sometimes a bidding war, almost, like you might say. Like the African Union and various reports might have estimated that there's 150 billion, I think, of illicit financial flows leaving Africa or leaving the global south in general. UNCTAD estimated it was 250 billion, and then Jason Hickel and company come and say it's 2.5 trillion, right? So it's you put a number to it, and then using these methods, the problem is that, and you claim it's representing illicit financial flows, it kind of opens you up to criticism. Sometimes quite easy criticism, because sometimes the basis of the measures can be easily discounted. And the problem with that is it discredits the broader arguments that we've been making for decades about the transfers of flow of wealth from south to north, essentially, right? I mean, a simple example here, one of the people who contacted me after the editorial was quite of an odd character, but nonetheless was meticulously going through the data that was used in these reports, particularly the UNCTAD report he was very critical of. And he was pointing out various basic things that were easy to dismiss. Like, for instance, a huge proportion, UNCTAD in this 2020 report had estimated that there was over a certain period of a few years, $80 billion worth of illicit financial flows from Africa to the north, of which about 30 to 50 was basically from South Africa and from mining and mostly from gold. And it was very easy to show how that in the gold trade, part of the problem of this is that a lot of the gold from South Africa, when it's exported, doesn't actually report a country in which it's going to, about 2/3 of the gold. And so actually, if you try and match that up with an importing country, you can't. A lot of this is often related to issues of what's called merchanting, which is, for instance, Glencore. We know, for instance, in Zambia that about half of copper exports from Zambia go to Switzerland. That's basically Glencore, who basically is exporting anywhere in the world, but when they export from Zambia, they don't know yet where it's going. It might go into a warehouse, it might stay on a ship or something like that, and in the meantime, they put Switzerland. But then the copper then goes somewhere else, maybe China, maybe the US, and so on. And so it leads to a huge amount of discrepancies in the data, which if you actually understand the trade statistics, you can identify. And again, as I say, the issue with that is that it can discredit the broader argument, which is still valid, right? Yeah, I was going to say something else about that, but I'll just move on in the sake of time. This was the report I was referring to from the African Union. And what I find interesting is I think they've learned, from what I can see anyways, they've learned from that, because unlike previous reports, they no longer actually state in this report an estimate of illicit financial flows. They actually are right up front and say it's very difficult to measure illicit financial flows, and there's many different methods, and there's lots of controversy and so on. The point is to strengthen the monitoring mechanisms of these flows and so on, right? So I think that's a good movement forward in this sense. But you also have this, this new emerging bunch of literature that's largely led from Jason Hickel, who of course I hugely appreciate for his role in international fora and raising issues and so on, but he has really pushed this idea on unequal exchange that I believe is very problematic. He uses what's called the exchange rate deviation index, which is essentially, he takes World Bank purchasing power parity exchange rates, and then he compares the difference between PPP exchange rates, and he augments the value. So let's say Zambia exports X amount of copper, $4 billion of copper to the north, and the PPP exchange rate difference between Zambia and the north is 3 times. He will then multiply those exports by 3 times and say that the difference between what Zambia exported and what we calculated is unequal exchange. I think as much as I admire the effort and the huge success he's had, I think it's hugely problematic for a whole variety of reasons. One is the use of PPPs to start with, because any of you who've studied PPPs or read my book or read Jayati's work and others, Himanshu and and so on, will know that PPPs are hugely problematic. Also, it's mixing up tradables with non-tradables. So essentially what you're saying, the copper from Zambia is a good idea, a good example. Copper from Zambia is traded at international prices. So why are you augmenting the value of the copper by the difference in exchange rates, PPP exchange rates? What the PPP exchange rates are reflecting is largely non-tradable things, like the fact that you can get a cheap meal in India, or it's much cheaper to, say, have household servants in many countries of the global south than it is the global north, and so on, these types of things. So you're mixing up these two things, whereas most of the trade is happening in tradables in that sense. Pretty much all, well, not all the trade, but what I would argue is that this is confusing. It's calling an unequal exchange. It's actually confusing relative levels of industrialization. Because essentially what it's reflecting, the higher price levels in the global north are reflecting the higher levels of productivity, industrialization, and so on. We can debate about how much this is being financed from the global south, but it's undeniable that, you know, they're advanced industrial countries. And the important point there is that a lot of, this is a really interesting, useful graphic, where a lot of where the value gets concentrated. We give this example of a cup of coffee sold presumably in London for £2.50, although now it's probably about £4 or something. But if you see where most of the value is being generated, it's being generated through tax, staff, and shop and rent. So it's not it's reflective of the cost of living, of the cost of rent, of the wages, and so on in the place of sale. Now, you can argue that that's unequal exchange, but it's more reflective of the control of the distribution process than it is, and it also is reflective of the cost of living in the location. So if this same cup of coffee is sold in India, I'm not sure how much a cup of coffee would be in India right now, but let's just say 50 cents or €1, you're effectively saying, okay, now suddenly the unequal exchange is much less because it was sold in India as opposed to in Europe and so on. There's other problems that are secondary. I don't want to belabor this, but I think it's useful to go through them briefly because they emphasize the point that I want to come back to, is that we need to be looking at the spaces of production and not at the spaces of trade, right? One big problem is, of course, 70% of international trade is actually happening intra-firm, intra-network trade. It's the movement of goods back and forth across countries before they actually get sold to the final point of sale. So basically, an example, an iPhone moves through about 13 different countries before it actually gets sent off to the US and sold. So for instance, what happens is that, let's say the US ships a bunch of components to various East Asian countries, they get added up and built out, and then it finally gets sent to China. China adds about the total of maybe $40 on a total value added of, say, $150. It gets shipped to the US. The export value of that iPhone is not the value added that China added, but is the total accumulated value added that it went through in about 12 different countries. So essentially, and this is the reason why in the period of so-called globalization since the 1970s, the value of trade has risen much faster than the value of GDP, value added, because basically trade data is double counting, triple counting, quadruple counting, and so on, right? As products go across countries before they finally sold. So if you're using trade data to try and reflect unequal exchange, you're actually bringing in a huge multiplication of the value added, and you're assuming, say, all the value added in the iPhone when it's shipped from China to the US is from China, when it's actually from Korea, Taiwan, and probably 10 other countries and so on. So it leads to double counting. There's the issues of value added and traded. And this also reflects the fact that in Jason Hickel's measures, China always comes up as accounting for a huge share of the unequal exchange. And now you could argue that maybe China is suffering from an equal exchange, but I don't think they're, well, anyways, we can have a discussion about that. Let me go over, just in the interest of time, because I want to get to the good stuff. I'll skip that last point there. But I think the main point, the red point, is that it all takes us back to the issue of industrialization and the control over the production, of who controls production. And I'm not saying, obviously, appropriation of value happens. It happens the MIG way, but these methods of exchange rate deviation index are not measuring that. They're not in measuring appropriation, right? They're making huge assumptions and so on. And as I said in the beginning, appropriation happens in the space of production, the control over production, especially in international networks, and the distribution of that, right? The coffee cup is just a small example. The big areas of international trade are, of course, in semiconductors, electronics, and all of those things, right? And what the thing too is that the appropriation happens in the space of production, but then it also gets transferred through financial processes, not necessarily trade processes, right? So we actually need to look at the financial, slow down. Sorry, thank you I tend to get carried away. J'allais dire pour les francophones, pardon, je suis bilingue, mais en économie, je suis plutôt francophone, je suis anglophone en économie, mais dans la cuisine, je suis plutôt francophone, mais voilà. Donc, pour des traducteurs, pardon, mais je vais continuer en anglais, je vais essayer de ralentir. So we need to be looking more at the space of the production and finance rather than trade necessarily, right? And I give the example of gold because one of my PhD students, Ben Radley, was doing this really interesting work comparing, so I'll try and slow, comparing artisanal gold mining with industrial gold mining, and was showing, for instance, in the industrial gold mines in DRC, that the wages of the miners were not really that much different from the artisanal miners, and that most of the value produced through the mined gold, about 85% of the value from the gold mine, was going to either national or international managers or profits, right? That appropriation of value to either the national, international managerial class or to profits is happening through the control of the gold production, not through the gold control of trade. It's actually quite easy to audit the export of gold, for instance, because based on weights, values, and so on, it's very difficult to fudge the value of gold in a sense. Whereas a huge proportion of the value appropriation is happening through the control of the industrial mining, right? So that's the issue essentially that I'm referring to. So we need to move towards more direct, what I would suggest more direct observational or case-specific measures, because these processes of production will be case-specific based on the nature of the commodity, based on the country, based on its nature of articulation into the international economy, and so on. So a sort of form of what we might call forensic accounting of the balance of payments data and the production data, which is what I was referring to at the beginning, I think probably has more potential for identifying things. So I'll quickly go into the data on Zambia, and I've been working on this for a while. It started because I had a research project actually looking at the things that Jayati was referring to about how a lot of aid is directed towards domestic spending, whereas it really should only be used for external spending. But in the process, I was analyzing the balance of payments data to understand issues of aid and debt absorption into the economies and so on. And I came across on the financial account in Zambia this very odd anomaly, which was very difficult to explain. But at first, what we see here in the balance of payments, this is a typical sort of export-oriented resource economy. Interestingly, Brazil is quite similar to this, even though it's a much more complex economy, where you have the country, at least since the commodity boom, has been running fairly large goods surpluses, largely copper, which are then being drained by the services account, which is all, and also profit remittances, which is the red line. And so as the country went into a financial crisis, what do you do in a financial crisis? You impose austerity. Austerity basically collapses imports. It solves the problem that the monsieur was saying in the previous session about printing money and so on. You throw the economy into a deep austerity and to generate a surplus, and then in the meantime, the foreign corporations are still draining the value you're generating through profit remittances and so on. So that's, okay, but that's a fairly standard, classic, since 1950s pattern of these types of economies. But if you go deeper into the financial account, if you see the red line there, the red line is what started to appear a bit odd, because what you essentially see, the red line at first follows the black line. The black line is the overall financial account. Just a quick reminder, this is following the Balance of Payments Manual 6 method, which in 2009 switched from measuring financial flows in terms of flows, which means to measuring the international investment position. Which is a bit confusing. I think it did a lot of our heads in trying to reverse our thinking on these things. But it's actually kind of makes sense, because according to the old approach, if you think of foreign direct investment, if you're measuring it by a flow, it sounds like foreign direct investment is just giving you foreign currency. Whereas if you measure it in terms of an international investment position, foreign direct investment comes as a liability. And I think it's an important point to remember that foreign direct investment is a liability, meaning that unless somebody settles in your country, they're going to eventually want to take the money out, right? And so it's a form of debt. It's a form of financial flow in a sense. And what we see in any case, the red line and the black line, is they're matched together. That was the debt cancellation in 2005, 2006. But then they diverge. And so you're sort of like saying, okay, what's exactly going on there? And then when they go together again, that was in the case of default, right? Which was different from the previous part. And as I was digging further into the data, I found this very obscure account on the financial account. It was on the other investment account of the other, it was on the net acquisitions of financial assets by other sectors, meaning not governments, not non-financial, not financial corporations, on the other investment, which is typically where you record most of your debt flows of the financial account. So essentially, I was like saying, and this amounted to, as you can see, in 2012, in the midst of the commodity boom, it amounted to about 20% of Zambia's GDP. In the midst of default, it amounted again to almost 20% of Zambia's GDP. So when I actually went to Zambia and I talked to the people in the central bank, and I asked what's going on here, and they said, oh yeah, they had been trying to figure this out as well. And they had certain data anomalies that they were dealing with, which they'd been working with for several years before that with the IMF. They shoved it into this account. It should have really actually been in the errors and omissions, which would have sent off alarm bells. But they shoved it into this account because they were assuming that it was just basically Zambian residents, which could include a subsidiary of Glencore, because most of the foreign exchange transactions in and out of, say, Zambia are dominated by the big mining companies. And they compared their data with the Bank of International Settlements data, where foreigners report their data to the Bank of international banks report Zambian resident holdings abroad, and they contrast that to their data in Zambia, and there's a discrepancy. So then they say, okay, well actually this discrepancy is therefore all these holdings that weren't reported by local Zambians. And their guess was that it was largely dominated by international mining firms. And actually since then I've come to realize that this account includes cash and deposits. Because at first I was wondering, well, what debt assets would Zambians have abroad, right? But actually cash and deposits is included in this category of other investment. And hence this is probably international mining companies just holding transfers abroad in international accounts as cash and deposits. It's being reported to the BIS, but not being reported to the local Zambian authorities. The thing is that, as the central bank in Zambia explained to me, and also the World Bank, the local resident of the World Bank, is that this is not happening through the financial sector, it's not happening through banks. The capital outflow is not being recorded by the banks because in the banking sector in Zambia is actually quite well regulated. So they don't necessarily have concerns about the bank sector being used for these types of transfers. It's largely happening by the non-financial sector, mining companies, because mining companies are not, because they're non-financial, they're not being regulated by the central bank under banking rules. And hence there's a huge amount of transactions that happen in the foreign mining companies that no one ever really keeps track of because they're not financial firms, right? And the reality is that it's these companies that then dominate the foreign exchange transactions, right? leading to a situation where you can have these massive outflows of wealth from in the midst of, say, a financial crisis, right? And actually, again, through the blog, and I got contacted by various people who pointed me in various directions. There was actually an IMF technical report on this. For instance, in 2019, this was after they had been investigating with the Bank of Zambia for many years. And they acknowledged they acknowledged in the report that there was a discrepancy was moved from the errors and omissions to the other investment component. Again, if you had put a 20% of GDP, if you had if you had put in errors and omissions of about 20% of GDP on the errors and omissions, it would have sent off alarm bells. People have said the balance of payments, whereas you hide it away in the financial account. But I'll just skip over this. In the interest of time. They also produced, the Bank of Zambia with the IMF produced a new export proceeds tracking framework in 2023. And just to highlight this part, is that they set out the process by which an international mining firm deposits their earnings in a local account, from which point onwards they're free to use the money in any which way they want to. So it's essentially a way, the problem is actually not about illicitness. The problem is that there's a freedom of use of the revenue of these companies that established by liberal mining codes and so on, that is a deeper part of the problem, because even if you solve the illicit financial flows, all the trade misinvoicing and so on, the reality is the companies basically have the freedom to use the money anyways, however they want, right? And the issue that is just the question of the revenue collection from the taxes. And so you have a situation like this, and I think this demonstrates it very well, the black line is the goods surplus versus the red line is my addition of the reported profit remittances with these obscured profit outflows on this obscured account of the financial account, which in the midst of the default in 2021 amounted to almost 28% of Zambia's GDP outflows of wealth from the economy, which are massive, right? And creating this very discombobulated types of economic structures in the country. And I just, very quick point, just to say that I did a quick check on Guinea, for instance, also a country, I think some people are from Guinea here, dominated by, we heard yesterday about iron ore and so on. Same situation actually, very interesting, where you have current account surplus being basically drained by the primary profit remittances of the service account, but also in this net acquisition of other investment assets, close to $4 billion US, which is almost 20% of Guinea's GDP at the time, right? So, and we need to, this is the analysis I'm saying, we need to be doing this analysis on all of these countries, right? Just as a conclusion, the deeper problem, it's a deeper problem than illicit flows, whereas I think the recent unequal exchange literature has taken us down the wrong track. It's about the externalized nature of economies, especially external ownership, and the way this articulates these economies into the international economy, and also the dominance of foreign corporations over the external accounts, especially that they're non-financial corporations and hence non-regulated. And in a liberalized setting, these flows are perfectly legal, right? And it points to a more fundamental structural issue about the dominance of foreign ownership and externalized articulation of these economies. So, thank you.
Thank you. Now that Professor Fisher has stated the case, we'll invite a couple of questions and comments. First, yes.
Merci beaucoup. Je voulais vous interpeller sur justement la mesure des flux financiers illicites, parce que bon, nous l'avons constaté quand même surtout dans les ressources extractives, là où on perd plus de la valeur créée ici chez nous, c'est par les pratiques des flux financiers illicites et la non-maîtrise des coûts de production dans les types de contrats qu'on signe et qui nous met en relation avec les multinationales. Mais je vais dire la même chose que Diallo tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire que bon, on insiste trop beaucoup à constater et à montrer ce qui ne va pas, ce qui manque, mais on ne fait pas progresser les instruments qui nous permettent de régler nos problèmes. Par exemple, quand vous dites ici que, bon, sur l'état de connaissance, on ne maîtrise, on ne s'accorde pas sur les techniques de mesure du mispricing, vous avez plutôt parlé du misinvoicing, mispricing, en tout cas de toutes ces pratiques d'optimisation fiscale qui, en fait, nous pillent. Mais moi, j'ai participé à une initiative, hein, j'ai travaillé à accompagner le Burkina dans cela, mais c'était la CNUSED, la Commission économique africaine et l'ONIDC qui ont travaillé sur la base d'une méthode de mesure des FFI. Et ça s'est fait sur plusieurs pays. Alors pourquoi on ne progresse pas dans ce sens-là? Mais je vais vous le dire aussi, parce qu'il y a aussi des résistances au niveau de la gestion de nos finances publiques. Parce que si le Burkina, par exemple, a publié son rapport, au Sénégal, ils ont refusé de publier les rapports. Pourquoi? Parce que les régies financières ont dit que s'ils publient ces rapports, ils montrent leurs propres failles. Voyez-vous où se situent les problèmes? C'est à notre niveau. C'est que c'est nous qui ne voulons pas avancer en utilisant les instruments techniques que nous avons qui nous permettent d'être très précis pour mesurer, mais le pillage dont on parle, dont Amina a parlé, tout le monde a parlé de ce pillage. Mais on refuse d'avoir des instruments techniques que nous utilisons nous-mêmes pour montrer, voilà, l'ampleur de ce pillage-là et comment nous pouvons faire pour les arrêter. Vraiment, c'est ce soir que je vous interpelle. Merci.
Okay, perhaps one more question, and then we'll ask Andrew to respond. Yes.
Thank you for that. Very quickly, can you speak more about the liberal mining codes and how they, whether any attempts at legislative reform should focus on national legislation, regional, international law, or international law in general?
Okay. So that will be the last question.
Hi, Prof. Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Sandile. I mean, I want to ask, at least maybe on your conclusion, that the main problem in these African countries is that, you know, their mining system is externalized and everything, right? Which ends up, you know, in certain instances lead to illicit financial flows. And illicit financial flows not being much of a problem really, but the problem really being how the structure of these economies are structured. I think, what is your antidote to that solution, right? Because in my thinking is that, I mean, is it nationalization and all of those stuff, right? Should there be some state involvement, you know, in these extractive sectors, right, so that you can be able to improve monitoring and all of those stuff? I mean, you know, in a form of owning some shares in this company.
The question is clear. Thank you.
En première question pour le monsieur, j'ai pas pris votre nom. Pour les fuites illicites, mon point c'est que oui, ok, on a focalisé sur ça. Donc on est très concentré sur comment régulariser et mettre en marche des bons systèmes de auditing, et des trucs comme ça. Et d'une certaine manière, on a avancé là-dedans aussi. Il y a quand même des... parce que même, par exemple, avec here, I'll just switch to English because I'll be quicker. The IMF and the Bank of Zambia and other organizations within Zambia have been working on these issues. There's a lot of resistance, as you say, or as somebody said, but to a certain degree, the auditing of the mining sector over these types of things has seen some small incremental improvements. But it's within exactly the liberal mining codes where these mining companies then have freedom to do whatever they want with their revenues once properly registered, right? So you can solve the illicit problem while exacerbating the liberalization problem. That's essentially, and then the liberalization, I mean, I'm not an expert on the mining codes, it's more my former PhD student, Ben Radley, who's works on that, and he just came out with a book on it where he goes into detail on that. But I think the point is that, say, these liberal mining codes, I mean, it's basically about giving these international mining companies more or less freedom of movement for all their financial flows and so on, and minimizing the taxes and royalties and so on the most possible, and that actually works against the logic of illicit financial flows. If you're working within a very liberal mining regime, as there's very low taxation on mining companies, or grace periods of 5-10 years and so on to encourage them to come, they don't actually have an incentive to avoid, revenue collection when they barely have any, because actually where they might take the money might be have higher taxation. For instance, and the motivations that drive them to take the money out elsewhere could actually be due to other things, like bolstering their position on the Toronto stock market, for instance, for a Canadian mining company or something like that. So that's where I think we need to think more in terms of, well, the solutions. The one thing I constantly go back to, and very briefly, yes, nationalization of assets. This is something I raised with Ndongo 3 years ago in Dakar. It's like, we talk about reparations, but reparations is always waiting for the North to sort of decide to become good and send money. But actually, you could have just actually imposing national ownership over this thing. I think there's an obsession with foreign direct investment because it's more productive, it's more technologically advanced, and so on. But when you look at actually the drain from foreign direct investment, actually the benefits are not there. So why not have a less productive nationally owned company running the mine instead? Now there's issues of the technological capacities of certain types of mining. There's certain types of mining that you can more easily control nationally, like gold mining, versus other types of mining like uranium mining, which is more complicated. But nonetheless, I think we have to, I think the bringing the issue of breaking the obsession with foreign direct investment and going back to national forms of ownership is crucial. Right?
Okay. I had a question about, I think you said something about the space of production. I wanted to ask about the production of space, as you say. But we'll talk about this later on. Unfortunately, we need to bring the session to an end, and I must admit that there remain many sticking points. The place of energy cities in the process of regional integration and the relationship between production of wealth, preservation of wealth, and the pre-distribution of wealth. I think it was George Padmore who asked Pan-Africanism or communism, but I guess for us we can ask regionalism, Pan-Africanism, or communism. In Beggar Strike, the distinguished Senegalese author Aminata Saoufal puts the case for collective self-reliance. But perhaps going forward, it seems the struggle is not just for another political economy, but for a just ecological political economy. Thank you very much.